The CSS box model is one of the most fundamental parts of CSS, and so you really need to understand it in order to learn CSS, and so that is exactly what we will do in this video. Now, what exactly is the box model? Well, the box model defines how elements are displayed on a web page and how they are sized. So in this box model, each and every element on a web page can be seen as a rectangular box. And each of these boxes can have content, a border, and space inside and outside of it. So let's define all of the pieces of the box model one by one. And starting with the content, this is the actual content of the element. So it can be text, or images, or a table, a video, or really any other content that we might specify. Using CSS properties, we can specify both the height and the width of the content area, which we will do in one of the next lectures. Next, we can define a border that goes all around the element. And actually, we already did that before, remember? And by the way, this border is technically still inside of the element. And now the next ingredient of the box model is the padding. So padding is basically invisible white space that we can create around the element's content. So between the content and the border. You can see that nicely in this diagram, and it will make even more sense when we start using this in practice. But anyway, just like the border, the padding is also still inside of the element. So essentially, padding is empty space that we can create inside of elements. Then, similar to padding, we also have margin. Now the difference is that margin creates empty space around the element, so outside of the element itself. So in practice, we use margin in order to create space between elements on our page. So if, for example, we want space between two certain elements, we simply specify the margin property on one of them. So again, padding is empty space that we can add inside of any element. It will sit between the content itself and the border, which is basically the outermost part of the element. So the content, padding, and border all together are the visible part of the element as we can see it on the page. Then around all that, we can add some margin in order to create space between elements. Now, what's important to note here is that all of these are actually optional. So we don't have to specify paddings or a border or margins. So we can define none of them or some or even all of them. It all depends on how we want our layout to look like. Finally, there is also something called the fill area. And this one can be a bit confusing, but let's try to understand it. So remember that the text content and images are inside the content box, right? Now, the same does not apply for background images or the background color of an element. These properties will actually be applied not only to the content area, but to the entire fill area, which also includes the padding and the border. So basically, if we apply a background image or color, it will occupy the entire visible part of the element. Now, for some people, this can all sound very abstract and hard to imagine in the real world. And so in these situations, it's very useful to think of an analogy in the real world. And one analogy that I personally find very helpful is to imagine a frame on a wall. So in this analogy, the drawing or the image that is in the frame is the content area. Then many frames actually have this kind of white paper between the drawing or the image and the actual frame itself. And so if we bring that back to our box model, then that would of course be the padding. So the space between the content area and the border. And so in this analogy, the frame is of course the border, right? So that makes a lot of sense. Finally, when we hang a picture on the wall using a frame like this, then of course there might be some space between other elements on the wall or even some other walls on the sides. And so in our box model analogy, that of course would be the margin. So it is the space that is outside of the frame and creating space between frames. So for example, there might be another frame somewhere here on the wall, and the space between those frames, so outside of them, is what we call the margin in the box model. Okay, so hopefully this analogy from the real world helps you bring these concepts back into the more abstract world of CSS. And now, just to finish, let's quickly learn how the box model actually calculates the exact size of an element based on the content, border, and padding. So, as I mentioned, we can specify the height and the width of the content area. Now, if we choose not to define the height or width, then the box model will simply imply them based on the content. However, these specified or implied heights and width are actually not the final sizes of the element. And that's because the border and the padding are also taken into account. So the final width of an element as we see it in the final layout is defined by the left border plus the left padding plus the specified or implied width plus the right padding plus the right border. And the same logic, of course, applies to the height of an element. So it's the top border plus the top padding plus the specified or implied height plus the bottom padding and finally the bottom border. Now, as you can see, the margin is of course not part of the width or height calculations of the elements, because again, it is just space that is around them. And as I said in the beginning of the lecture, we can of course specify all these individual sizes using certain CSS properties. Now, what's very important to note here is that this way of calculating heights and width is actually just the default behavior of the box model. However, we can change this default behavior because it actually doesn't make much sense. And we will do that a bit later, but for now, I don't want to confuse you anymore. And so let's start by using this default behavior starting right in the next video.